one day in Rome, good young Father Jindrik, that will be Henry in English, who's from the Czech Republic, muttered to the effect that this is the day we can go into the cell of St Aloysius. He was an expert in the secrets of Rome, an interesting character himself, for he had received the Cistercian, or rather the Premonstratensian habit, within the communist regime, and therefore under the radar. It was all done in secret. And so he was full of information, bristling with facts, and very much prepared when he came to Rome, which he long desired. And so we would go places. So we reached the cell where this young Jesuit died. He'd only been in formation for 6 years. His story is unusual, although not that unusual for this first or second generation of Jesuits, for a lot of them came from the higher classes of society, which explains to some extent the power they had, because they knew exactly how to hit hard on precisely those who would be future leaders of society. And when ordained, they would tend, if they could, to become chaplains in key areas, form future leaders, which gave them therefore a huge influence as time went on. So he himself was of a noble family at Castiglione, between Brescia and Mantua in Italy. His own father wanted him to become a soldier, and indeed he wasn't without interest in the military career when he was young, because we know that there's one anecdote that he had the daring to fire a cannon without authorization at one stage, so he could have gone that way, but the Lord had another project. He was hugely influenced by his saintly mother, also a noble lady, and we see that also in his last letter to her, which we can quote in the end here. As he was dying, he was influenced by a certain time in Spain. Spain, of course, being one of the big centres of the Counter-Reformation. He served for a while in the court of Prince Asturias in that country. He and his brother Ridolfo had also served for a while in the court of the Duke of Mantua itself. But on his return to his own country, he was from that northern part of Italy, he made known his desire. It was in July of 1584 that he showed that he meant business. He wanted to enter the very fervent new society of Jesus, and he transferred his right of succession to his own brother, Ridolfo. So on the 25th of November 1985, he entered the Jesuit novitiate in Rome. And when a student in Rome, second time round, I would drift towards the Church of the Gesù, one of their main centres in the world actually, where many things would happen at this period, professions and so on. And there's a reason why we young priests would do that. The altar of the Sacred Heart is the one that has the original painting that went round the world, because you know the Jesuits were the ones who promoted it because of the link between, by now, Saint Claude de la Colombière and Saint Miriam Alacoque, the Parelemonial. He was her spiritual father and remained faithful to her to the end. But without his influence, there was no hope that that devotion would go round. So the original there is on the right altar of that huge church. And it's quite moving when one celebrates before it actually, because one sees, as one is offering up the burning heart of the Saviour, and one feels the warmth of that heart pulsing in one's hands and before one's eyes. Which is, by the way, precisely what the Lord wanted. He wanted to soften people's hardened or cold, and the problem was Jansenism and all that went with it. It was a period when people were afraid of approaching the Lord, and he wanted that healed. Therefore, at least one communion a month, and that was a big thing in those days. I close that parenthesis, but it's not without importance either in this week of the Sacred Heart. So, he was there in the capital of Christendom, lived there for 6 years with St Robert Bellarmine as his spiritual director. Now, it's interesting that he'd already been given his first communion at the fairly early age at the time of 10 by St Charles Borromeo himself, the great reformer of Milan were the great figures of this Counter-Reformation. So he was surrounded by sanctity. He did receive the minor orders at St John Lateran and continued to prepare himself for the priesthood, dreaming of the foreign missions, which is often what the case was with these early Jesuits. And of course, one of the nearest foreign missions was going to be our own in England, and there they did a lot of good underground amidst torture and rack. And by the way, when I was staying in Rome in 1975, doing classics there, I noticed that nearly opposite the Venerable English College, which is right in the middle of Rome, there is the old church which St Philip Neri had, San Geronimo, and the tradition is, and it's probably true, that when the newly ordained were leaving the Venerable English College to go into the boat there at Ostia to go over to England eventually, he would come out, kneel at their feet and kiss their feet and say the first words of the hymn of the Holy Innocents, Salvete flores martyrum, hail flowers of martyrs. And he envied their lot. He knew that they were future martyrs and saints. So this was the fervour of those early Jesuits. And in the Venerable English College, which is called Venerable because of all this that went through there, those early saints, it's full of pictures of those who went there with the cord of Tyburn round their neck. So there was a plague in Rome in 1591. He was nursing the sick, and like several other members of the Jesuit community, he contracted the disease, and he didn't really ever recover from it. And apart from that, he was fairly low in his immune system because he had been very, very austere and fervent. And St. Robert Bellarmine was trying to calm him down on that one because his health was important. Anyway, he didn't survive, and he died, therefore, very young in that cell that we were able to pray in some years ago in Rome. And if one comes out of the cell, one comes down to a balcony and looks down on a courtyard, a quad, and there were young boys playing football and things. It was still the Collegio Romano to this day, a place of education. Therefore, there's not been a break in the education in that building to this day. So he died at midnight between the 20th and the 21st on this day, the longest day in the year. One of the shortest lives, but one of the longest days. So he was dying with the name of Jesus on his lips. The actual liturgy of the day tries to pull out all the elements of his spirituality, and he has a message for us. As we have them, the prayers of the Missal refer to three characteristics, and it was Pius XI who proclaimed him patron of the youth in 1926. He may, of course, eventually have another one by his side, not in the too distant future, Blessed Carlo Acutis, because he would be a saint for our time, but he has to be canonized first. But you can well imagine that he would come on track and perhaps given a title such as Patron of the Internet, but he would be somebody for our days, raised up under modern modalities for the youth of our time, able to address them in a language they would understand. The opening prayer indicates how God combined remarkable innocence with the spirit of penance, and asks that we who have not followed his innocence may follow his example of penance. Now, like all the saints, Aloysius accused himself of being a sinner, but the fact is that he never stained his baptismal innocence. He followed a schedule of austerity and mortification from which he did not deviate, even when he served at court, which is interesting, because he could have gone either way. Those who serve in court can be very much influenced by what's going on there. And after entering the Jesuits, he became even more austere. The Latin version of the prayer over the gifts would have spoken originally of the wedding garment of St Aloysius, referring of course to the parable there in Matthew 22. So that's being referred to there as the garment of charity, which was very much his case. His love of God was so intense that he frequently fell into ecstasy. So in there he was, see, they're not too far away from each other. Those two churches, Church of Gesù and Collegio Romano, and also what was being built at the time, the Chiesa Nuova, the great church of the nascent Oratorians. That's where the body of St Philip Neri is, right in the heart of Rome. And of course he's called the Apostle of Rome, and I was able to celebrate there in his private chapel, which is not in the main church itself, it's in the building of the oratory next to it, and it's not changed at all. And he would go into ecstasy there for 2 hours. So the same experience of these saints, and these of course are part of the internal reform of the Catholic Church. The way the Lord wants it done, one doesn't break away, one does it from within. The Lord, bless him, doesn't follow those who break away, and that's something to be borne in mind right now, with a tendency to split off as though we were purists. Well, the purist is the Holy Spirit, and we listen to him. Once we go outside him, we're doing our own thing, and his blessing will not necessarily follow. In fact, Satan can use goodwill, misguided, to make the church split even more, and it's better to be aware of that. He uses bits of good to do bad. Precisely the angel of light, of which St Paul speaks when writing to the Corinthians, he disguises himself. So discernment. I remember at St Antimo, when I was sacristan, I'd sometimes have to show people around the sacristy, which was also the most ancient part of the building. It was the Carolingian chapel, a chapel in itself, and on the wall there were ancient frescoes, because it had been a Benedictine house for centuries. And there was one scene where, it was from the Desert Fathers, a monk was in his grotto, in his cell, peeping out, and there was an angel coming to him, apparently an angel with wings, but he was pointing out to him, and he was detecting that it was actually a devil in disguise. And if one looks at the feet, they're like those of a pig. So he was right. That's what discernment of spirits is about. We have to have that in our time, because one needs to have that flair, being able to smell a spiritual rat amongst good appearances. So, ecstasy, not only in the chapel, but sometimes at meals and during the recreation period. Now that reminds us of other saints. There's one closer to us in time, recently canonized. It's Miriam, Marie de Jésus Crucifié, the Lebanese stigmatized Carmelite, who couldn't even read actually. She was a lay sister and a very, very holy mystic with all the gifts, and it's through her that we know lots of things, even where the true Emmaus is, that wanted a Carmel built there, and he gave her himself the architectural plan for the building of the present Carmel of Bethlehem. He was behind that, and it's circular like the Tower of David, and all the windows look upwards to heaven, to the clouds, indicating what he wants of the sisters and of us too. But she also would go off into ecstasy at all unforeseen times and go into trees or whatever, she would go. But once the superior commanded, she would immediately come out instantly. One time she had a slight fraction of a second of hesitation to come out of ecstasy, and there she had to climb down very slowly, branch by branch, and said, l'agneau parti, je dois redescendre par mes propres moyens. The lamb having disappeared, I have to come down by my own means. So by that she understood that she had to obey immediately, and that ecstasy wasn't to be for one's own satisfaction. But the interesting thing is that the Lord would make her aware in ecstasy that the command was being given. That is true test of authenticity, obedience. Because that's the most supreme sacrifice, the will. And that's what got Luther into trouble eventually, because he was a brilliant man, but the will became independent. One has to listen to the voice of God coming through with authority, even though it means apparently coming through a weaker channel, it might be. But nevertheless, the channel is the correct one. So a vision of the Lord corresponding to what we have in the Blessed Sacrament. We don't adore the monstrance or compare the monstrance with the next monstrance. We look at the Lord. The monstrance contains the Lord. So obedience is to the Lord, not to the monstrance. So this same charity prompted him to serve the sick and the needy, and to have a preference for the poor and lowly, in spite of his noble heritage. And then the third characteristic which is picked up liturgically is his Eucharistic Devotion, which we can pick up and take with us. It's quite specific. There's a reference there to the bread of life. It comes in the last part, the communion antiphon and the concluding prayer refer to these elements of his Eucharistic Devotion. We ask that we may serve God without sin and spend our lives in thanksgiving. Now that is referring to the fact that 12 hours of his day, each day, will be spent in preparation and 12 hours in thanksgiving for Holy Communion. I've been told that when I was a novice in France, and it was something that we were reminded of, the importance of preparation and thanksgiving. And in the monastic life, the contemplative, quiet, isolated life, one can do that because there's nothing happening before or after, and therefore one can absorb well. And it's important. And actually in the Carthusian way of doing things, it's all very much physically orientated. The low Mass after the conventual Mass, which is not celebrated on a weekday, there one is with the novice master, whoever it might be, and one is on one's shoulder. It's actually the Carthusian way of doing it. The celebrant goes prostrate there on one side at the altar step before and after, and we do the same also at Holy from the first elevation, which is the only one. We don't have a second elevation in the Carthusian order. Down, one is on one's that position of being prostrate at the altar, and thanksgiving with the novice master afterwards for about 10 minutes. So it's very much an absorbing inner spirit of sleep, resting on the breast of the Lord, and therefore that is the maximum of absorption. Also there's fasting until midday, so it's all very much an ingestion and a quiet penetration. That is all lost if one starts to talk or if one does other things like nowadays opening mobile phones before or after. One can't do two things at a time with that intensity, so the mind can't be split and get the same blessings. If one means business on that one has to show one means business. Therefore the preparation is physical and concrete, not just angelic as though we were angels without a body. What goes in complicates the inside, and therefore the earlier one celebrates sometimes the better, because one isn't contaminated by what is just about to happen or going to happen the rest of the day. The quality of early celebrations is much more intense. The Church knows that from early times, and it's something that we need to be aware of. The virginity of the early dawn and pre-dawn is something that we don't get afterwards. There's a stillness there which gives us the maximum contact with the Lord. So this was what they had up until really the changes that came in the 60s and 70s when they started bringing in later celebrations. Until then, still in the East, all the celebrations are in the morning, and there's a stillness there in the fasting and empty and quiet heart. God served in a vacuum, no other thing troubling the stillness of the soul. And one word in that can go a long way for nourishment. And so there's a reference in the formal liturgy of this saint to the angelic. This was toned down somewhat in the revised prayers so as to make him closer to us, as it were. But nevertheless there was an angelic element about him, and we can't undermine it in the interest of being modern. He knew, for instance, that he was going to die on the octave day of Corpus Christi. He had that premonition, and he asked for viaticum. So he got viaticum even though he did not seem to be in immediate danger of death. Now that happened something similar to one of our brethren at Selignac, because Dom Martin, who had been prior, he entered at the age of 17 with my novice master, and he was a very holy man. He never spoke, he was extremely silent, and he knew also that he was going to die. He was by then with the nuns, a chaplain to the Carthusian nuns, and he left a billet for the superior. He knew the Lord was coming for him that day, and he left this message for them. And he wasn't ill, he was only 67, and the message was he knew the Lord was coming for him, and he was to leave him his spiritual testament, and it was just this: le secret de la vie intérieure, c'est le saint silence. The secret of the interior life is holy silence. And I've never forgotten that word, because it does contain it all, because all the energy then goes towards the one that one is there for. If one talks a lot, one leaks a lot. And all the spiritual authors will say that. It's in the maxims of St John of the Cross, for instance. To be a great talker is to be in a situation that one can't be an interior soul, because the interior soul is one who doesn't leak. So it's logical that one is economic in one's words and says what is useful, and that the words have an impact. The more one speaks, the less one has an impact. Words are like leaves, and where they most abound, much depth of sense beneath is seldom to be found. And in that context he writes a very intense, not a wordy, but an intense letter to his mother, who of course was probably a saint herself, but not canonized. And we have this testimony as he was, probably by the time this letter got to him, he might have actually been dead. I write all this with the one desire that you and all my family may consider my departure a joy and favour, and that you especially may speed with a mother's blessing my passage across the waters till I reach the shore to which all hopes belong. How different from some of the little BAs that one finds now by young people who've just taken their life. How different an entry into eternity. So we need to pray for this situation. The young people are more than ever at risk of losing their soul because they're most solicited by all that's out there. Anything that works, the devil will use. We have to be aware of that. If we have young people in our hands, as you do, shield them for all you can from what is out there, not by talking down to them, but with them, that they themselves may build up the immune system and know they only have one chance. Eternity is a long time to mess up with a little bit of time.
Christ be before me, Christ be behind me, King of my heart. Christ be with me, Christ be below me, Christ be above me, never to part. Christ on my right hand, Christ on my left hand, Christ all around me, sharing the strife. Christ in my sleeping, Christ in my sitting, Christ in my rising, light of my life. Christ be in all hearts, thinking about me. Christ be in all thoughts, thinking of me. Christ be the